Hi gentle people, I'm Val, welcome on 18 Squad Lab. Today we will tackle the first episode of a series of 2 video tutorials related to the creation of an epic polar exploration diorama. In this episode I show you how I realized the M29c Weasel, a World War II amphibious tracked vehicle specially modified in the late 40s to face the extreme polar conditions. This model is proposed by Takom M29c. I will show you how to spare your money by doing things yourselves with cheap materials and using easy techniques. No need to invest in expensive resin parts to complete this kit. Even the wheels and track assembly from the kit can give you a much nicer appearance if done correctly. I will also show you how I painted and weathered it to give more life to this little vehicle. Let's start with the construction of this original kit. I've read many comments on the social networks where people share concerns and or poor comments on the wheels and track assembly of this kit. Let's be clear and honest. The Weasel was a tiny vehicle with 64 wheels. So if you expect something sweet and easy with this vehicle at scale 1/35, you might be surprised. That being said, there is nothing wrong with this kit, and you just need to be calm, patient, and work step by step. The wheels are first carefully cut and sanded to avoid any flat section, given their small sizes. I use an articulated arm with clamps to maintain the bogie perfectly horizontal, on which I then inserted the wheels. That way the wheels position themselves properly. You just have to add a drop of extra thin liquid glue and the job is done. The plastic of the kit is soft, which makes it really easy to glue the pieces together in a matter of seconds. The process to fix all the wheels on the bogies is really simple and quick with this method. The suspension is a bit more complicated, given the size of the different pieces. The bogies here are articulated on their suspension arms thanks to 2 little plastic pins or anchor points on their inner section. These 2 pins need to be a little bit reduced to facilitate the entry of the suspension arm. The most important point here is to work step by step, following the plan carefully and double-checking the pieces' numbers prior to cut and glue them together. Avoid to cut multiple pieces at once, doing the assembly later, especially for the track elements and the 2 tension wheel arms. All pieces look similar, but in fact they are pretty different. The tension wheels arm, for example, can't be switched. If you inverse their position, the track length will be incorrect later. I also advise you to sand all pieces carefully and to make a dry fit test prior to glue each element to be sure that the fitting is perfect. As you can see, I started first to glue all the different suspension elements on the main chassis prior to fix the bogies on them. As I said, dry fit test is essential prior to try to glue any pieces on the suspension. Some minor corrections are sometimes required to have a perfect fit. To get a little bit more flexibility from the suspension arms, I only glued them partially in position on the chassis so that when I install the bogies on these suspension arms, I'm still able to move them a little bit to adapt their position. Final gluing is done only after the bogie is correctly installed on the chassis and the final position looks correct. I also worked a complete side at a time, without stopping, so that I can take advantage of the fact that the glue isn't perfectly dry and the plastic is still soft to align the different components correctly. I will also glue immediately the lowest section of the track below the different wheels. This first track element has to be correctly located in between the central hubs of the first and the last wheels. This will greatly strengthen the whole assembly and will facilitate the alignment of all the different bogies. We can now fully glue all the different suspension arms correctly with a second layer of extra thin glue. Okay, it's now time to install the return rollers and the driving sprockets. The tension wheel and the tension wheel arms will be installed later. Well, it's now time to work element by element. Watch out with the numbering of the track elements. Each individual track element is cut and glued at a time prior to continue with the next one. Watch out with the unusual aspect of the chassis. The front side is the lowest side, which gives this Weasel a NASCAR race car appearance. So do not confuse the front part of the vehicle with the rear side or confuse the left side with the right side. This could generate errors that won't be possible to correct afterwards, and this might have an impact on the final track length. I also decided to sand the different track elements to remove the ejection pin marks on their inner side and the track links that were a little bit too important to my opinion, to reduce the gap in between the different track elements. To facilitate my work around the driving sprockets, I've decided to cut the central inner teeth. As you can see, I've started to complete the different track elements starting by the rear side of the vehicle, turning around the driving sprocket, coming back forward above the return rollers to end up the work with the tension wheel. Watch out here not confuse both tension wheel arms. They look similar, but their angle is different. So do not mismatch the numbering of those two tension wheel arms. As you see, it's only at that moment that I glue my tension wheels on the chassis. The idea here again is to get a little bit of flexibility on the glued point to adapt slightly the position of this wheel with the different track elements. As you can see, without having to adapt anything, the track length is correct. All the elements are fitting together nicely. Now, there are some tiny gaps in between the different elements, but nothing really important, and given we'll stage our vehicle in the snow, this gap will be easy to hide. Prior to continue with the assembly of the rest of the chassis, I've decided to paint and weather completely the wheels and track assembly. It's just because, to my point of view, the distance between the upper side of the track and the main chassis will be so small that it will be impossible, once assembled, to paint and put some snow on the track correctly. But I will come back on painting and weathering later. The rest of the construction of this Weasel was quite easy. I just regret that sometimes Takom do not include different view angles, just to understand better how the different pieces are organized. But honestly, there are plenty of real pictures of this Weasel on the internet that you can use to help you positioning some pieces. The fitting of the different assemblies is rather good. I didn't experience great difficulties with that. But again, I really advise you to go for some dry fitting tests to see where you must do some adjustments. You can see here that there is not even a small gap to fill in with putty. Everything is fitting nicely. If, like me, you are interested to realize the French polar exploration vehicle used in the late 40s, you will have to realize yourself the upper canvas structure. This structure is available on the market in resin. It costs around 15 euros. Personally, I have decided to make this structure myself with steel wire having a 0.7 mm diameter. I soldered these wires, even if I'm not an expert with that. I only soldered pieces myself a few times in the past, so I have no specific experience. All you need to do is to put a little bit of grease on these pieces and then to use tin to make the soldering. At the end of the process, we just have to sand the excess of tin and the job is done. What's interesting with this method is that, aside of being very cheap, the metallic structure has a very realistic appearance. The metal tube looks bent, twisted, and obviously this will give a much more realistic appearance to our final tarpaulin. Prior to jump on to the painting procedure, a few words quickly on the navigation rudder's command cables. These cables made a link between the rudders and a kind of steering wheel in front of the driver. The Takom instruction manual really sucks with regard to these cables and gives almost no information about how they have to be placed on the vehicle. So a little bit of research on the internet will greatly help this work. To realize these cables, I use brass rod with a diameter of 0.3 mm. These are products produced by Albion Alloy. The advantage of working with rigid brass rod is that you can maintain straight sections whenever you need and create folded sections just by heating the metal using a torch. Watch out anyway not to break these thin rods by heating them too much. As soon as you see that brass is changing color, you can stop. It's enough to make the rod more flexible. Once happy with the global shape of the cable, you just glue it easily with cyanoacrylate glue. Don't forget that there are two of these cables to be created running alongside the hull of the vehicle to both command rods of the left rudder. Let's speak now about painting and weathering. As usual, we start first by washing all the pieces correctly to remove the grease left by our fingers and the residual sanding plastic dust. I used Mr. Mahogany Surfacer 1000 to prime the complete model, dilute it at 60%, and for the application, I used an air pressure of 1.5 bar using my needle 0.4 mm. The base coat of this model was done using Real Colors RAL 2004 Orange from AK Interactive and the Maize Yellow RAL 1006. My base coat is a mix of 95% of orange and only 5% of maize yellow, diluted at 60%. This paint mixture is applied on all the exterior surfaces and the top surfaces. The interior section will be painted in olive drab later. As seen on some historical pictures, occasionally some of the wheels were still painted olive drabs, probably spare parts. These weasels were World War II veterans that had been recovered from the army, and these polar explorations at that period were partially supported, at least logistically, by the armed forces. Once the base coat completed, I applied the highlights with a mix of 50% orange and 50% maize yellow, diluted in between 60 and 70%. For this work, I still work with my 0.4 needle, but I removed the needle air diffuser to gain in precision. The idea here will be to fade a little bit the colors on all the sections that are more exposed to the UV radiation, especially in these Arctic regions. So we will focus this work mainly on the horizontal flat surfaces above the vehicles, but I will also apply this mixture on the vertical sides, but only on the upper areas. It's a kind of zenithal light technique. It's not really modulation technique, but it's just to fade the colors from top, which is the most faded, to bottom, that is the least faded. This process will already create a kind of color variation to break a little bit the monochromatic appearance of the vehicle. This color variation will be reinforced later during the weathering process, working with oil paints. This process has to remain subtle, so you have to work with more diluted paint. After this first highlight, I will do a second pass with 70% of maize yellow and only 30% of orange. But this time, with even more diluted paint, we dilute the paint between 70 and 80%. This process will be quicker and we will only focus our work on the more exposed part of the vehicle. The idea is to build up the effect layer by layer. As I said, the Weasels were military vehicles that had been painted rapidly in orange for the purpose of these explorations. But the interior was still olive drab, so the interior was painted using 80% of olive drab and 20% white. The dilution was about 60%. We will apply then the highlights with 50% olive drab and 50% white, diluted at 70%. We will only execute one pass of highlight for the interior section. Here, the idea is more to create more worn-out sections within the interior compartment. We will apply these highlights on these parts of the vehicle that were more exposed to maintenance and crew use. After all this work with the airbrush, it's now time to work with the paintbrush prior to the weathering procedure. The tracks will receive a mix of rubber black and grey to achieve a kind of dark grey base coat on which we will apply a dry brush with the steel reference from the AK Interactive True Metal range. We will also use this paint for the central wheel sections and the guiding teeth of the tracks. We then have some tools to paint on the chassis. The wooden parts have been painted using first a sandy color, on which later, after application of the gloss coat, we will apply burnt umber oil paint that we will drag with a flat paintbrush slightly dipped in white spirit to give this kind of wooden veins appearance. The small fire extinguisher on the front section of the vehicle was painted with old bronze True Metal reference on top of a flat black acrylic base coat. To conclude this painting session and prior to the weathering step, we will apply a good coat of gloss varnish. I use the AK Interactive Gloss Varnish Real Colors 502. It's required prior to apply the different decals, but also to start the weathering procedure with the oil paints. After 24 hours of drying time, we can start to apply the different decals. There are not that many for this tiny vehicle. These decals are not provided in the box, so you need to find them on the internet if you are interested. They are manufactured by Star Decals. The words Expédition Polaire Française are provided in one single long decal, so personally I've decided to separate the different words and cut the carrier film as close as possible from the letters to limit the risk of silvering. It requires a little bit more work to respect the alignment and the words separation, but it's worth the effort, as in the end of this process the carrier film of the decals will become completely invisible. The weathering session starts with a classical approach. We will start to create scratches with a sponge and with a smaller paintbrush. For these scratches, I have selected an olive drab color as the orange coat was applied above an olive drab painted vehicle. We will of course focus this work on the most worn out areas, so on the different corners, but as well on the different areas of maintenance. We can then apply a dark wash on all the different parts of the model. For this, I used a mix of lamp black and raw umber oil paints diluted with white spirit. I do generally prefer my homemade washes than the ready-to-use products available on the market, just because I have a better control on the opacity and the intensity of the wash, but also on the final color of this wash. We will then remove the excess of wash with a flat paintbrush slightly dipped in white spirit. This is also the good moment to start to create the first dirty areas and to create the first vertical streaks on the main chassis. This procedure will be obviously also applied on the inner part of the vehicle. The last very important big step with regard to the color variation on this vehicle will be to work with oil paints. This method is important for all monochromatic vehicles, whether they are grey, olive drab or orange. The fact that you are using a single color can give a dull appearance to your model. This procedure will not only bring more color variation, but it will also emphasize the contrast between the different areas of the model. So that means that, for example, using darker colors like a deep orange-red color in the corners will emphasize the sensation of depth. At the end of the process, we will create some vertical streaks on the lateral sides of the vehicles. Raw umber and burnt umber will be the main references to create dirt streaks alongside the hull, mainly close to mooring rings, rivets, or corners where dirt can accumulate. We will also use different colors like a deep orange-red or faded orange to create different kind of vertical streaks as if the original paint had been washed. Well, to seal all this work and to better integrate the decals within the paint job, we will finally apply a good coat of satin varnish from VMS. This varnish is applied pure from the bottle with 2 bars of pressure and a 0.4 mm needle. Prior to be able to close the upper tarpaulin, we need to insert all the different details inside the vehicle. That means the small radio, but also some jerry cans. We will create fuel stains close to the fuel filler cap, realize the instrument dials with some UV resin, and install comfortably our 2 polar explorers, Marcel and Alphonse, in their seats. This is where you realize how small and uncomfortable was the Weasel. Let's not forget their Springfield rifle to hunt seals and other animals to bring food back to the station. Well, that's basically it. We still have to do the microphone for the radio, paint the cable, and we can start the creation of the upper tarpaulin. Before you ask to me from where come those figures, basically these are mini art plastic figures that I completely modified and resculpted with Magic Sculpt, and the heads are coming from Hornet. I'm not at all an expert at figure sculpting nor at figure painting, but to my knowledge there is no reference available on the market to find polar explorers in a sitting position to be inserted within a Weasel. Black Dog is offering 3 polar explorers, but unfortunately they are all 3 in a standing position. Last building step prior to add some snow on this Weasel, we will realize the upper tarpaulin. To realize this canvas, I made use of Getz Miniatures Blackmagic metal foil. These pre-primed in black metal foils are really flexible. They are easy to bend without breaking. It's a very nice product that you can use to realize seat belts, tarps, metallic clamps, so a wide variety of objects that are used in scale modeling. In order not to lose any small pieces of these foils, I really advise you to work first with paper templates. I didn't find any historic technical reference of that tarp, so I had to rely only on reference pictures. After having checked that my paper template were fitting correctly on the Weasel, I cut the exact same pattern on the Blackmagic foils. The 2 rear windows of the canvas were done with acetate foils having 0.1 mm thickness. As we can see on many historical pictures, the side panels of this upper canvas were often folded in open position. That's why I decided to retract them, so that we can still continue to see a little bit the inside of the vehicle, even if I must admit the visibility on the interior section will remain extremely limited. As you can see, it's very easy to bend the Blackmagic foil in all directions to give it a very realistic appearance. I also use these foils to create the canvas straps, so it's a very versatile product that also preserves the very thin thickness of the canvas. To create a little bit more color variation with the interior, I decided to create my own mix of olive drab using these three Tamiya references: 5 drops of XF58, 4 drops of XF55, and 3 drops of XF49. I did another darker version to create some spots on the upper surface, including more XF58 and less XF55. This mixture was also used to paint all the corners on the inside of the canvas. It was mandatory to paint the tarpaulin prior to put it in position, as afterwards it wouldn't be impossible to paint anything on the inside of the cabin. I finished the painting job on this canvas, adding a small lighter version, more diluted, of our olive drab, just by adding a bit more deck tan in the mixture. I finally glue all the different canvas sections on the metallic structure using a silicone brush to print the metallic tube silhouettes onto the canvas. That will increase even more the realistic appearance of this tarpaulin. The last step will be to add a coat of satin varnish from VMS to increase the harmony with the rest of the vehicle. To complete this M29c Weasel construction, it was now time to add some snow. This procedure was divided into 2 steps. Step 1, the creation of hoarfrost, and step 2, the creation of hard snow. Hoarfrost can be found when your vehicle is left outside during the night, for example, and there is a lot of humidity, while having negative temperature. To reproduce hoarfrost, what I did was to airbrush a lot of gloss varnish with a kind of wet surface, and immediately afterwards, without waiting the varnish to dry, I dropped on top of it a lot of snow microballoons. The excess of snow microballoons is blown away with the airbrush with a little bit of air pressure. You can reproduce this action and superimpose the different layers of snow microballoons until you reach the desired rough texture. Generally, it took me 2 to 3 layers at a maximum to reach a nice frozen appearance. To create hard snow, I did a mix of terrain snow and still water. Both products are from AK Interactive. I applied this snow with a small brush here and there, working very small areas at a time, and while still wet, I directly apply on top of it snow microballoons. It's important to work small surfaces at a time, as this hard snow is drying fast. You can remove the excess of snow microballoons directly with the airbrush with a little bit of pressure. Snow microballoons will create an additional texture on top of your mixture that will give more realism to your snow. If you see that your snow mixture is slowly drying, you can just add a little bit of still water inside of it to keep it wet. It's important to keep this mixture wet so that the snow microballoons can have a grip on that mixture. Well, my dear friends, this is it for this episode. In the next episode, we will create an epic diorama using this M29 Weasel. We're gonna sculpt some polar bears, some Greenland ring seal, create the ice pack, breaking below the Weasel's weight, and finally create the underwater life below the ice. Many thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to help me grow this channel. Many thanks. See you next time. Greetings from Portugal. Ciao, ciao.